Hello, dear soul. Welcome, once again, to Sleepy Whispers, your quiet corner of the night, where only the softest thoughts remain, and the world can gently fall away. You are here now, and that is enough. And if you enjoy these journeys, if your heart feels calmed by flickering stories told in the hush of night, I warmly invite you to subscribe to our channel so that there will always be a tale waiting for you. And then, let it fall, soft and easy, out through your lips. Feel your jaw unclench. Let your shoulders sink lower. Let your eyelids grow heavier. And where cobblestone paths wind like roots between cottages of old stone and timber. Something sacred. And glass, its panels etched with symbols too faded to read, that even in the fiercest wind or deepest rain, it never dies. No cathedral bells herald her arrival, no town crier calls her name, she simply appears, drawn by need, by silence, by suffering. And with each movement the golden glow of her lantern touches the world around her, brushing across old carvings, climbing ivy, crooked fences, and flower pots long since emptied of bloom. The light, golden and soft, spills like honey across the shutter slats, and for a moment, the child stirs. Fades. In the calm that rises up like spring water after drought. Warmed by the lantern's glow, the earth beneath you soft and ancient, and the stars above bright enough to carry dreams. Only this night. Only this light. She pauses only once, beside a door carved with the symbol of an old healing order, now worn down to a swirl of half-forgotten lines. A slow, reverent exhale that seems to deepen the flame. Then she turns, continuing her slow procession through the heart of the sleeping village, the light ahead of her a halo that softens even the hardest corners. At the crossroads, where the stones give way to soft earth and wild thyme grows in tufts between roots, she stops and kneels. The air here carries the scent of moss and ash. The wind moves gently, lifting the hem of her cloak and weaving through the grass with the tenderness of fingers through hair. She places a hand upon the wood, not to knock, not to enter, but simply to listen. Inside, a child lies restless in bed, her brow damp, her breathing uneven, her dreams haunted by smoke and shadow. Her mother sits at the bedside, eyes rimmed with exhaustion, one hand clutching a damp cloth, the other tracing the shape of a cross over and over in the air, her prayers too soft to hear, but full of trembling hope. And when she has done her quiet work, she disappears again, her light receding like a memory, leaving behind only whispers and softened dreams. Its handle wrapped in soft cloth, worn thin from use. A single road loops through it like a loose thread, leading past a long abandoned chapel with broken windows and a roof of sagging slate. The houses, small and time-worn, lean into the dark as if seeking comfort from each other, and the air carries the smell of wood smoke, wet earth, and something faintly bitter, as though the soil here remembers sorrow. And somewhere in the darkness, the land speaks, not in words, but in pulse and breath and memory. The night listens back. The fields lie fallow. The animals sleep fitfully. And the people are quiet in a way that is not peace. The silence here feels thick, like cloth pulled too tightly across the chest, and even the wind seems reluctant to speak. The woman who carries it walks slowly, her figure cloaked in ash-gray wool, her hood pulled low against the chill. With each step, the lantern sways, casting golden ripples of light across the cobbles, touching ivy-covered walls and shuttered windows, making even the shadows seem gentler. Here, there is only stillness. Here, there is only story. And now, together, we begin. The sky above this village is cloaked in midnight blue, rich. Some believe she is the last pilgrim of a lost abbey, walking a penance older than memory. Others say she is a relic seeker, a woman who once loved a saint and now carries his light to the forgotten places of the world. And still others, especially the children, whisper in wonder that she is part fire herself, that her breath smells of wax and smoke, and that her voice carries the hush of prayer. But none can deny the miracle of her flame, the quiet wonder that glows within that small lantern, said to burn with the same fire that once flickered upon the altar of Saint Elira, a flame never extinguished, blessed by devotion and fed only by faith. And endless, and scattered across it like spilled silver dust, are stars, blinking softly, patiently, as if listening. There is no moon tonight, only the deep velvet of the dark and the hush of sleeping fields, and yet, along one path, narrow and glistening faintly with evening dew, a light moves gently through the night. The world outside can wait. A gentle place to return to, like a hearth glowing in a distant inn, its light never fading, always waiting. To rest, to breathe, to dream. If you haven't already, I invite you to find a place where your body feels supported and safe, perhaps you nestled beneath familiar covers. Or lying back with the comforting weight of a blanket draped over you like a gentle embrace. Maybe your head rests on a cool pillow, or your hands are folded near your chest, still and warm. Wherever you are, I want you to feel that this time, this moment, is just for you. My name is Leah, and tonight, I'll be your guide, a soft voice to walk with you along ancient paths, to carry you into sleep like a lantern lit beneath stars. So now, take in one deep, unhurried breath. Draw the air in through your nose, and feel it fill your chest like the slow rise of a tide. There is nothing more to do. No more thoughts to hold. Only this story. Our tale tonight begins at the edge of a quiet village, one nestled deep within a forgotten valley where the trees lean low over mossy rooftops. It is not the harsh flicker of a torch, nor the pale shimmer of starlight, it is something warmer, older. Her name is Elira, and across villages, hamlets, and roads worn thin by wind and time, she is known simply as the healer with the holy flame. They say this lantern, her lantern, needs no oil. On this night, the village Elira approaches is unnamed on any map. Still, Elira walks on. Her steps are quiet, barely more than a whisper upon the stone, and just then, outside the window, the lantern passes. Outside, Elira lowers the lantern slightly, and for the first time tonight, her lips move, not in words, but in a breath. She places the lantern upon the ground beside her and closes her eyes. Not to sleep, not yet. But to listen. To feel. And so, dear listener, as you lie in stillness, with breath slow and deep, feel yourself there, kneeling beside her. You are safe now. In the stillness of that village hollow, where the lantern's light painted soft gold across the time and the dark arms of the trees held back the sky like patient guardians, Elira did not sleep. The soil here was old. The stones beneath it older still. She felt them in her chest, like the way a harp might still vibrate long after the string was plucked. She reached out, slowly, brushing her fingers through the thyme, and the leaves released their scent, green, sharp, grounding. There had been a chapel high in the mountains, its windows stained with saints and storms, its pews carved by hand, its altar lit by a single eternal flame said to be guarded by the prayers of generations. She had gone there seeking healing, not for her body, but for something more difficult to name. She did not remember the journey, only the silence of the place. And how, when all the monks had long vanished and ivy hung in thick curtains across the door, the flame had still burned, waiting. She closed her eyes as she exhaled, and something within her, something old and aching and tender, slipped into the air with it. Its wooden door sagged on rusted hinges, its bell tower cracked where lightning had once struck, and moss grew thick along its foundations. But the stone walls still held, and its threshold, though warped, was still a line between outside and in. Its glow spread outward, catching the faint glint of iron nails, the pale thread of a spider's web, the faded carving of a dove in flight. The chapel did not stir. And yet, something in it seemed to lean forward, listening. Elira stepped through it, ducking slightly beneath the lintel, and inside, silence greeted her like an old friend, giving light to walls that had not seen it in many winters. For a moment, the silence deepened, stretched, and then softened. When she opened her eyes again, the flame flickered, once, as if it had received the message. She left the lantern there for a time, letting the stones grow warm with its light, before lifting it once more and continuing on. The lantern beside her did not flicker, though there was breeze enough to tease her hair loose from beneath her hood. Its flame did not dim, did not waver, even when she walked through storm or sorrow. Broken pews leaned against one another like weary travelers, and the altar, stripped bare, stood in quiet defiance, as though waiting for someone to remember its name. Elira walked slowly down the center aisle, her footfalls muffled by time. Not to pray, but to offer presence. At the altar, she paused. It frayed under her touch, and she could almost hear the splash of water far below. And so, each night, she offered it to the world, not in proclamation, but in presence. And paused again, this time beside a small well where the wood had rotted but the rope remained. Her fingers brushed it. Villagers said the well had soured, but Elira suspected it was only forgotten. Things lost hope when they were ignored. She knelt beside the stone lip, placed the lantern carefully upon it, and again, breathed. She did not speak of salvation. She simply walked, and let the light speak for itself. She did not promise miracles. Its flame simply glowed, steady and alive, casting a soft halo that pushed back the edges of the night without banishing it. The flame cast shadows like old stories along the walls, a rooster-shaped weather vane that hands tea turned in years, the bent frame of a once-loved wheelbarrow, the delicate arch of a lace-curtained window behind which an elder woman lay dreaming of her youth. These shadows danced only slightly, in time with her pace, and in their motion there was something deeply soothing, a reminder that time moved gently, even when it felt harsh. She leaned toward it, ever so slightly, not to speak, but to breathe. And as her breath touched the glass, that gentle warmth, barely visible, the flame flared subtly brighter, as if exhaling in return. There had been other villages, once, built and forgotten. Paths once walked and then overgrown. And under it all, veins of memory ran like water in darkness, whispering, not in words, but in the sensation of time, of presence, of the weight of everything that had been. She rested, yes, with her knees to the earth and her cloak folded beneath her like moss, whether by ritual, relic, or rhythm, no one could say. But she remained awake in the way that trees do, not stirring, not dreaming, simply aware. She did not need many hours of sleep. Or perhaps more truthfully, sleep sought her differently than it did others. Not in long stretches of unconsciousness, but in little drops of silence gathered throughout the night, moments where the heart slowed, the mind floated, and breath mingled with the wind. Above her, the stars shimmered without urgency, and though the village around her slept, something deeper remained awake, the very land, perhaps, remembering. Elira understood these things, though she had no words for them. And wherever she wandered, it remained unchanged. They were connected, she and the flame. Not even Elira herself. She only knew that when she had found it, or perhaps when it had found her, something in her had quieted for the first time in many years. The world no longer pressed against her quite so sharply. Her grief, once raw and tangled, became something softer, like old cloth folded away in a drawer, still present, still hers, but no longer unbearable to touch. It was not large, and time had not been kind. She remembered, faintly, the sanctuary where the lantern had once lived, though it was more memory of stone and echo than of place. Now, it went with her. Tonight, when she rose from the time-soft hollow and resumed her quiet steps through the village, she passed beneath a crooked archway where roses had once bloomed, their thorns now dry and brittle. This breath was deeper than the last. At the far end of the village stood a chapel. Dust swam in the lantern light, rising and falling like the breath of the building itself. She placed the lantern on the stone. She stayed there a long time. Breathing. Remembering. And somewhere beyond the chapel walls, the first breeze of morning stirred the branches. Faint. Cool. Alive. Dawn had not yet broken, but the breath of it was in the air, a quiet promise on the horizon, thin and silvery, still cloaked in darkness, but tinged with the faintest premonition of color. The wind that curled its way through the empty chapel came not with sound, but with a shift, a subtle change in the balance of the room. Feeling the grooves where hands had once clasped in prayer, where knuckles had whitened with grief, or relaxed into reverence. The scent of the place was one of memory, wax, old pine, damp stone, and something floral but dried, like the ghost of lavender once hung in bundles along the beams. Smoke now rose faintly from a chimney or two, curling skyward in lazy spirals that caught the golden light of her lantern as she passed. A narrow footpath led between broken stone walls, where nettles grew and birds nested, and she followed it as the lantern lit the way. The path curved gently with the contours of the land, and the ground beneath her feet was soft with loam and fallen leaves. Beyond the field lay a copse of trees, their trunks tall and close, their branches overhead forming a vaulted canopy more cathedral than forest. But the stillness around her welcomed tears, had they come. The flame in the lantern remained steady, casting long beams across the ground, making the dew shimmer like scattered stars. She sat there a while, not counting time, not planning the road ahead, but simply being. And in that stillness, something inside her softened further, like ice melting in spring. She placed both hands in her lap, her posture relaxed, and began to hum, a low, resonant sound, barely audible, carried only to the moss and the oak and the distant listening sky. As she stepped beneath them, the quality of sound changed, the wind no longer moving in open eddies, but in whispers, as though the trees were breathing in unison. It rose and fell like breath, slow and deep, and the earth seemed to answer in return. Leaves trembled lightly above her, and a bird called out once, soft and round. Even the insects seemed to slow their rhythm, drawn into the quiet. It was a sound meant not to awaken, but to soothe. Not to proclaim, but to heal. Somewhere, a rooster gave a single half-hearted crow, as if uncertain whether the day had truly begun. Elira did not rush. Her steps remained steady, her pace that of one who has walked many roads and has never yet needed to hurry. The first tendrils of light slipped between the trees, touching bark and leaf with delicate color, blush pinks, honey golds, the faintest lilac at the edge of the clouds. But transformed, as though it now carried some of the dawn within it. Her journey was not mapped by roads or markers, but by presence, by the quiet knowledge that wherever darkness settled, however softly, there must also be something to greet it. A small light. A held breath. She wrapped her cloak more tightly around her shoulders and turned eastward toward the narrow forest path that would carry her to the next village. The next soul in need of light, the next silence waiting to be met with warmth. Morning had come, not with trumpet or fire, but with gentleness, as if not to disturb what needed more time to rest. The building, though abandoned, was not empty. A hush that somehow deepened the silence rather than disrupting it, as though the chapel itself had sighed in its slumber. Here, in the shelter of the trees, the world was still and cloaked in green shadows. She came upon a clearing where an ancient oak stood alone, its branches wide and gnarled, and beneath it, a low stone marker covered in moss, no writing left, only the shape of remembrance. Elira paused, kneeling beside it, setting her lantern gently upon the stone. She rested one hand on the mossy surface, her eyes closed, her breath slow. Elira stood with her back to the altar, now her lantern once again in hand, in the bark of trees, in the hush between birdsong and breeze. The air held the density of feeling, the quiet ache of something once known and now only felt. It was not sorrow, exactly. Its glow warming the worn faces of the statues that lined the inner wall, saints with chipped fingers and hollow eyes, their names long rubbed smooth by time and weather. The flame within the lantern pulsed softly, no longer in defiance of darkness, but as a companion to it, not fighting it back, but making peace with its presence. Its rope had long since rotted away, and the bell itself was cracked down the center, but gentle, like the closing of a book meant to be opened again one day. But the sound of it still echoed in her mind. She imagined the bell being rung at dawn, not in alarm, but in welcome. Not to call people in, but to tell them, you are not alone. There is still light in the world. There was something sacred in that harmony. She walked the length of the chapel once more, her fingers brushing the tops of the pews. Elira paused by the door before leaving, glancing up at the arch where a bell once hung. And with that, she stepped into the cool breath of morning, her feet meeting the stone threshold with a sense of farewell, not final. Outside, the village remained wrapped in its own dreams, rooftops slick with dew, windows fogged, doors closed against the chill. She turned toward the fields, now edged with the faintest silver where the horizon peeled back the darkness. She walked until the village was no longer visible, only the faint trace of chimney smoke curling upward in the far distance. There were places where the world was thinner, she had learned, places where memory was not confined to the mind but lived in the very soil. She did not weep. It was not a melody known to any songbook. And still the lantern glowed. When at last she rose, the sky had begun to bloom. Elira lifted her lantern. Its flame remained unchanged by the rising sun, not dimmed by the daylight. She did not know the names of the places she would find. And so she walked, not away from the village, but onward. Always onward. The forest path she followed was little more than a thread between the trees worn into the earth not by carts or caravans, but by the passage of quiet feet. The forest began to open, and ahead she glimpsed a break in the land where a low hill rolled gently upward, crowned with wild grasses and the ruins of something once man-made, the soft bones of a stone outpost or perhaps the foundations of a long-forgotten mill. She made her way toward it, the path dissolving into open meadow, and paused at the edge of the ruins to breathe in the horizon. Elira moved with the stillness of someone accustomed to silence, not shunning it but welcoming it as a companion. Not sharply, not painfully, but in the way old letters might rise to the surface of a dream, fragments of the life she had lived before the lantern, before the wandering, before the silence had become her language. Illness, war, the slow undoing of place and time, whatever the cause, the laughter had faded, and in its place came stillness. Some tried to fight it. Not to flee, no, never that, but to offer what she still carried, the quiet flame, the steady hand, the willingness to be where others turned away. She had not always been alone. Once, there had been laughter, not loud, but frequent, shared like bread between companions. But through light, the golden glow of the lantern reaching around the bend before she did, illuminating the edges of the scene with a kind of warmth that spoke louder than words. Her voice broke like a branch too dry to bend. "I didn't see you." The horse stilled almost immediately, nostrils flaring as if sniffing something long remembered. The woman turned, her eyes wide, then narrowing in a mix of awe and relief as she took in the cloaked figure approaching through the morning haze. "I thought I'd be stuck here till dusk," she whispered. She simply let it live in her, like an old melody that sometimes found its way back to her lips when the wind was just right. There had been hands that held hers without demand, and eyes that did not need her to be anything other than what she was. And then she walked on, back into the trees, leaving the woman standing in the light. She raised the lantern slightly, and as its light brushed over the wheel, the mud seemed to loosen, the axle straightening just enough that the woman's weight might free it. She gestured, a gentle motion of the hand, and the woman, understanding, moved to the far side of the cart, pressing her shoulder against it with renewed strength. In the tilt of the head, in the steadiness of being truly seen. You're her, aren't you? The one with the saint's flame." She touched the side of the cart briefly, letting the lantern's light spill across the wood, and then turned as if to leave. It gave way at once, the wheel slipping free of the rut with a soft squelch and settling back onto the path. She followed the contours of the land, letting the hill's slope guide her gently downward until her feet found another trail, this one broader, edged with grasses crushed by passing boots. A horse's uneven whinny. Just beyond the next bend, nestled between two trees and the banks of a lazy stream, a cart lay tilted, one wheel sunken deep into the mud, its axle creaking with each shift of weight. A woman stood beside it, mud streaking her skirt, her hands trembling as she tried to calm the skittish animal hitched to the front. A sign of travelers. She followed it not with purpose, but with openness, her path determined less by destination than by invitation. If someone needed the light, she would know. The air around her was thick with the scent of damp bark and last year's leaves, mingled now with the faint sweetness of wild primrose blooming early in the underbrush. Here and there, a low stone wall curved like a sleeping serpent, and far in the distance, a ridge of hills rose blue against the morning sky. It was a view shaped not by grandeur but by gentleness, a landscape worn into kindness by centuries of wind, rain, and the tender hand of time. She stepped forward slowly, letting the lantern light flicker over the stones at her feet, some half buried in moss. Others still etched faintly with the signs of human craft, symbols carved without haste by hands that once believed they were leaving something behind that mattered. Somewhere in the branches high above, a dove cooed, not to call attention to itself, but simply because that was its nature, soft and steady and low. The trees shifted as she walked, the canopy thinning gradually until the light grew stronger, dappling the ground with pale gold that danced with each breeze. Beyond the hill, the world widened. Fields stretched out in lazy patchwork, green and yellow, gold and brown, stitched together by hedgerows and winding streams. Elira found a place to sit among the stones, where the ground was warm from the sun and the wind moved just enough to make the grass sigh. She rested the lantern beside her, where its light could mingle with the brightness of day, no longer the sole flame, but still distinct, a golden echo in a world of silver light. She looked out across the fields and let her mind drift, not into thought, but into presence, a deep, slow awareness of place and moment, of breath and heartbeat, of sky and soil. It was in places like this that she sometimes remembered. But as with so many stories, the tide had turned. She did not mourn that choice, even now. As the day grew brighter, Elira rose once more. And indeed, as she passed through a low gate fashioned from braided willow branches, she heard it, not a cry, not a shout, but the soft thrum of distress carried on the wind. Elira did not rush toward her. The woman began, then faltered. Elira offered only the smallest nod, stepping closer with a quietness that seemed almost unnatural, not because it defied sound, but because it matched the moment so completely. The woman stepped back, panting, brushing her hands against her skirt, tears springing unbidden to her eyes. Elira gave a soft smile, not with her mouth, but with her presence, the kind of smile that lived in the corners of the eyes. "Wait," the woman called. Elira paused but said nothing. As the forest drew her back into its embrace, Elira did not glance behind. She knew the woman would remain still for some time, hand pressed to her heart, mind swirling not with confusion, but with something slower and deeper, the quiet unraveling of fear, the dawning realization that some burdens are not meant to be carried alone. The path would dry with the rising sun. The wheel would hold now. And by the time the woman reached the next village, she would wonder whether what she saw had truly happened, or whether it had been a dream stitched together by morning light and exhaustion. But the flame, that would linger in her thoughts, not as proof, but as comfort. Elira walked on. Here, the world was quieter, not in absence of sound, but in the depth of it. The forest floor was padded with needles and moss, and every footstep seemed to draw the silence in closer rather than disturb it. The stones formed a wide circle, their surfaces lichen dappled, their edges softened by rain. Its trunk was twisted, its bark furrowed like the pages of an unread book. And at the center of this sacred space stood a tree, not the tallest she had ever seen, nor the grandest, but old in a way that demanded reverence. The lantern, however, flared, not violently, but in recognition. This was not a place to rush. This was a place where the bones of the world lay close to the surface. Its glow joined with the filtered light of the day. It was not a word. Just as Elira. It was definitely something you could feel. She simply breathed. Or perhaps the place knew it. And in the rhythm of that breath, the world opened slightly, just enough to be felt, just enough to be known. Where wishes had once been buried with hope. And the lantern in her hand glowed steady and sure. Where stories slept beneath the roots. It knew this place. Not many, but enough to speak of quiet pilgrimage, a doll carved from willow, a ring wrapped in thread, a stone etched with a name. It was not a voice. And it welcomed her, not as an intruder, but as one who had walked long enough to be allowed rest. Elira knelt and placed the lantern among them. Not as healer, not as pilgrim, not as flame bearer. breathing like the flame. And when at last she rose, she did so with a softness that echoed the space itself, as though the tree had granted its blessing, as though the grove had shared a memory with her, and now she carried it with her like a lantern within the chest. The woman who had once sought a light and found it. The woman who now offered it, again and again, wherever it was needed. There was something in the air. A call, perhaps. And for a moment, everything, the tokens, the moss, the bark, even the very air, seemed to shimmer. Not brightly. Not obviously. But deeply. A need. Allowing it to touch her skin. The ribbon on the tree lifted slightly in her wake, then stilled. The wind, satisfied, began to stir again among the branches. And from its lowest branch hung a ribbon, long faded, fluttering in the breath of the wind. The sun had not yet fully penetrated this glade, and so the lantern's light painted everything in warm amber, lending shape and meaning to even the smallest things. The spiral of a snail's trail, the scatter of feathers where a bird had preened, the half-moon print of a deer's passing. The lantern, though small, seemed to cast more light than it ought, not bright enough to burn, never that, but radiant in the way of old hearths and sun-warmed stones. And the surface rippled with the slow, deliberate pace of time itself. It was the kind of breeze that carried scent, memory, or song, and Elira turned her face into it. The lantern, too, responded, its flame bending slightly as if to listen. The stones beneath the current were smooth and pale, polished by centuries of rain and frost, and a narrow footbridge of twisted branches spanned the stream, its railings woven like basketry, its boards damp but firm beneath her step. She paused at its center, the lantern held just above the waterline, and watched as its glow shimmered across the surface, caught and distorted by the flow. The reflection wavered like a flame in a mirror, not identical, but deeply true. In the way of childhood memories and lullabies half remembered. It was the light of memory, of presence, of stillness given shape. Even the birds fell silent. Even the wind grew still. As she moved through the trees, it glinted off wet leaves, casting shifting patterns on the bark, dappling the ferns with golden halos. Birds stirred in the upper canopy, calling to one another with soft notes, not urgent, but familiar, the language of the woods waking gently to the day. She came at last to a narrow stream where the roots of the trees dipped into the water like fingers, and as she stood there, the wind shifted, brushing past her cloak with a sudden, feather-light urgency, not cold, not strong, but directional. She followed it. The path now narrowed again, the trees growing closer, branches low enough that she ducked beneath their reach. And then she saw it, not the source of the wind, for wind has no true source, but the place it had guided her toward. It was a grove, ancient and ringed by stones, each one tall and upright, placed with care and deliberation long before names had been written or histories spoken aloud. Elira stepped into the circle. The moment her foot crossed the threshold between stone and moss, the world quieted further still. She moved toward the tree with measured steps, her breath shallow, not from fear, but from awareness. At the base of the tree were tokens. She lowered her head, not to pray, for her prayers had long since ceased being requests. Something shifted in the tree. Not visibly. But Elira felt it in her bones, the way one might feel a thunderstorm in the joints or a change of season behind the ribs. She stayed there, motionless, her hands folded lightly in her lap, the lantern casting soft shadows across her face, and let herself simply exist in that space. Time did not pass quickly there. Nor did it stand still. It moved in a different way, circular, like the stones. She left the grove without turning back, her footsteps as silent as her arrival. When Elira emerged from the grove, the sun had risen higher in the sky, not in a blazing arc of triumph, but in a mellow ascent, its light filtering through branches and bathing the world in a kind of golden hush. Low hills patterned with meadows and thickets, little copses of trees where birds darted and chirped, and in the far distance, she could see the slate-tiled roofs of another village, nestled against the bend of a wide, slow-moving river. Smoke rose there in smooth columns. Carts moved slowly along its main road. And though she could not hear the voices, she could feel them, layered over one another like the woven threads of a tapestry. The laughter of children, one of them, a boy, perhaps 8 or 9, caught sight of her and paused mid-stride, a wooden sword dangling from his hand. And river water, until the voices around her had folded into the background like the rustle of leaves. She passed unnoticed by most, a traveler among many, and yet wherever she walked, the atmosphere shifted by degrees. A tired woman sitting on her doorstep seemed to straighten just a little, her brow relaxing as she watched the stranger pass. A coughing child, curled in his mother's shawl, took in a deeper breath and exhaled with more ease. A blacksmith, mid-swing, paused for only a heartbeat before smiling to himself and returning to his work with more rhythm than before. Then she stood, took the lantern in hand, and stepped into the village as softly as a memory. He stared for a long moment, and Elira met his gaze without challenge, only a calm, open stillness that made him blink and then smile, though he didn't seem to know why. The flame within stirred, then steadied. "It's good," he whispered. "Good that there's still one walking." There, an elder sat alone on a stool, his legs wrapped in thick cloth, a cane balanced across his knees. Around them, the village moved on, people bustling to and from homes and shops, a dog barking in the distance, the clatter of hooves on cobblestone, but within the circle of light, time curled inward. She knocked on no doors. Midges danced above the surface, catching the last golden light. She walked, and that was enough. Frogs called out from the shallows. And the sky, oh, the sky, wore its dusk like a shawl woven from lavender and coal, streaked faintly with coral, kissed by the cooling breath of evening. His eyes were milky, and his head turned slightly as she approached, not with alarm, but with awareness. And let the night rise to meet her. There, she found a wide oak with roots that dipped into the water, its trunk split in two like a cradle. She stepped into its hollow, placed the lantern on a root polished smooth by rain, and leaned back against the bark. Elira rose without sound, leaving him with the warmth of the lantern's afterglow, and stepped away into the quiet heart of the village. After a beat, he ran off again, his laughter trailing behind him like a ribbon. She offered no potions, no incantations. She carried no satchel of herbs nor tools of trade. Only the lantern. And herself. The gentle scold of a baker, the quiet murmur of an old man sweeping his stoop. It was a place alive with the echo of ordinary life. The trees beside the path no longer loomed but stood like guardians with open arms, their leaves catching the light in translucent green sighs, casting shadows that swayed with the rhythm of the earth. She paused at the edge of the forest, just beyond the last standing stone, and turned her face to the sky, feeling the warmth touch her cheeks, eyelids, and the arch of her hands. It was not heat she sought, but the invitation of day, the gentle pull to begin again, to step forward, to be present wherever presence was asked. From here, the world unfolded in soft waves, not wild, not vast, but welcoming. Elira did not rush toward it. She followed the rhythm of the land, her feet moving where the path gave way to field and the field to grass, her lantern held low now, its light not announcing, but observing. It was not always needed in its full glow. Sometimes, it was enough for the flame simply to exist, to accompany, to witness. There was healing in presence, even when unspoken. As she neared the outskirts of the village, she came upon a stone bench beneath a sycamore tree. Its leaves already beginning to show the faintest blush of the season has changed, not yet autumn, but the whisper of it. A place where one might pause, not because they were tired, but because they wished to take in the moment. And so Elira sat, her cloak folding neatly beneath her, the lantern placed beside her feet, its glow mingling with the dappled light that filtered through the branches overhead. Children played nearby, their voices a low murmur of joy and argument, the kind of bickering that always ended in laughter. She remained on the bench until the shadows had shifted, until the breeze carried the scent of bread. No one greeted her by name. Elira asked nothing. She came to the square, where a well stood beneath a canopy of ivy, its stones sun-warmed and worn smooth by generations of hands. "You've come far," he said, voice soft and dry as parchment. Elira inclined her head in quiet agreement. "The flame still burns?" he asked, as though it were not her burden but her companion. She lifted the lantern gently. The man smiled, slow and deep, like someone remembering the shape of music. They sat together in silence then, the lantern between them. After a time, the old man nodded off, his chin resting lightly on his chest, his breathing deep and even. She visited no houses. When the sun began to dip low in the sky, brushing the tops of the buildings with its amber light, Elira made her way to the edge of the river where the land flattened out into muddy reeds. The river flowed slowly, curling past with the sound of thick silk being drawn across stone. And Elira, who had walked through so many places, and brought her light to so many stories, simply closed her eyes. As the forest drew her back into its embrace, Elira did not glance behind. She knew the woman would remain still for some time, hand pressed to her heart, mind swirling not with confusion, but with something slower and deeper, the quiet unraveling of fear, the dawning realization that some burdens are not meant to be carried alone. The path would dry with the rising sun. The wheel would hold now. And by the time the woman reached the next village, she would wonder whether what she saw had truly happened, or whether it had been a dream stitched together by morning light and exhaustion. But the flame, that would linger in her thoughts, not as proof, but as comfort. Elira walked on. Here, the world was quieter, not in absence of sound, but in the depth of it. The forest floor was padded with needles and moss, and every footstep seemed to draw the silence in closer rather than disturb it. The stones formed a wide circle, their surfaces lichen dappled, their edges softened by rain, its trunk was twisted, its bark furrowed like the pages of an unread book. And at the center of this sacred space stood a tree, not the tallest she had ever seen, nor the grandest, but old in a way that demanded reverence. The lantern, however, flared, not violently, but in recognition. This was not a place to rush. This was a place where the bones of the world lay close to the surface. Its glow joined with the filtered light of the day. It was not a word. Just as Elira. It was definitely something you could feel. She simply breathed. Or perhaps the place knew it. And in the rhythm of that breath, the world opened slightly, just enough to be felt, just enough to be known. Where wishes had once been buried with hope. and the lantern in her hand glowed steady and sure. Where stories slept beneath the roots. It knew this place. Not many, but enough to speak of quiet pilgrimage, a doll carved from willow, a ring wrapped in thread, a stone etched with a name. It was not a voice. And it welcomed her, not as an intruder, but as one who had walked long enough to be allowed rest. Elira knelt and placed the lantern among them. Not as healer, not as pilgrim, not as flame-bearer. Breathing, like the flame. And when at last she rose, she did so with a softness that echoed the space itself, as though the tree had granted its blessing, as though the grove had shared a memory with her, and now she carried it with her like a lantern within the chest. The woman who had once sought a light and found it. The woman who now offered it, again and again, wherever it was needed. There was something in the air. A call, perhaps. And for a moment, everything, the tokens, the moss, the bark, even the very air, seemed to shimmer. Not brightly. Not obviously. But deeply. A need. Allowing it to touch her skin. The ribbon on the tree lifted slightly in her wake, then stilled. The wind, satisfied, began to stir again among the branches. And from its lowest branch hung a ribbon, long faded, fluttering in the breath of the wind. The sun had not yet fully penetrated this glade, and so the lantern's light painted everything in warm amber. Lending shape and meaning to even the smallest things, the spiral of a snail's trail, the scatter of feathers where a bird had preened, the half-moon print of a deer's passing. The lantern, though small, seemed to cast more light than it ought, not bright enough to burn, never that, but radiant in the way of old hearths and sun-warmed stones. And the surface rippled with the slow, deliberate pace of time itself. It was the kind of breeze that carried scent, memory, or song, and Elira turned her face into it. The lantern, too, responded, its flame bending slightly as if to listen. The stones beneath the current were smooth and pale, polished by centuries of rain and frost, and a narrow footbridge of twisted branches spanned the stream, its railings woven like basketry, its boards damp but firm beneath her step. She paused at its center, the lantern held just above the waterline, and watched as its glow shimmered across the surface, caught and distorted by the flow. The reflection wavered like a flame in a mirror, not identical, but deeply true. In the way of childhood memories and lullabies half remembered. It was the light of memory, of presence, of stillness given shape. Even the birds fell silent. Even the wind grew still. As she moved through the trees, it glinted off wet leaves, casting shifting patterns on the bark, dappling the ferns with golden halos. Birds stirred in the upper canopy, calling to one another with soft notes, not urgent, but familiar, the language of the woods waking gently to the day. She came at last to a narrow stream where the roots of the trees dipped into the water like fingers, and as she stood there, the wind shifted, brushing past her cloak with a sudden, feather-light urgency, not cold, not strong, but directional. She followed it. The path now narrowed again, the trees growing closer, branches low enough that she ducked beneath their reach. And then she saw it, not the source of the wind, for wind has no true source, but the place it had guided her toward. It was a grove, ancient and ringed by stones, each one tall and upright, placed with care and deliberation long before names had been written or histories spoken aloud. Elira stepped into the circle. The moment her foot crossed the threshold between stone and moss, the world quieted further still. She moved toward the tree with measured steps, her breath shallow, not from fear, but from awareness. At the base of the tree were tokens. She lowered her head, not to pray, for her prayers had long since ceased being requests. Something shifted in the tree. Not visibly. But Elira felt it in her bones, the way one might feel a thunderstorm in the joints or a change of season behind the ribs. She stayed there, motionless, her hands folded lightly in her lap, the lantern casting soft shadows across her face, and let herself simply exist in that space. Time did not pass quickly there. Nor did it stand still. It moved in a different way, circular, like the stones. She left the grove without turning back, her footsteps as silent as her arrival. The lantern, still glowing at the base of the tree, gave off no heat, and yet the air around it felt warmer, not in temperature, but in spirit, as though its flame softened the very space it illuminated. Its golden light shimmered across the exposed river roots and the soft patch of moss where Elira had settled herself, casting shadows that moved only when the wind stirred the leaves above, but floated instead in a quiet space of semi-consciousness, where each sound, each scent, and while she rested, the village behind her softened, two lights dimming behind drawn curtains, meals being finished, feet washing clean in basin water. Lovers held hands in silence. Dogs circled once, then settled by hearths. Children yawned. The ground was soft beneath her feet, and the path ahead was no more than a trail worn by foxes and the slow press of memory. She followed it nonetheless, her lantern leading her not with demand, but with invitation. She walked parallel to it for a while, following the sound more than the sight, a low burble, the occasional splash of a fish or drifting reed. As she moved farther from the village, the world grew quiet again, the kind of quiet that comes when even thoughts decide to rest. And it was in that lull, in that perfect stillness, that she saw it. It was the turning of the world, that sacred change between day and night, and though no bell rang to mark it, though no candle was lit with ceremony, something deep and old acknowledged the passage. She had sat where Elira now knelt, cradling something in her lap, not a child, not a wound, she simply acknowledged it. Let the lantern bear witness. Let the silence hold it gently, without judgment. The lantern's light flickered across rocks and bramble, its glow catching now and then on the eyes of a fox, the wing of an owl, the glint of dew. The sky had grown vast again, the stars spread wide and endless above her, a map too old to read, but too beautiful to ignore. But perhaps a letter, or a bundle of cloth that once held promise. She had left no name, no carving, no token. Only the memory of her sorrow, lingering like perfume long after the wearer had gone. The way lost letters find their way home decades later. The lantern was not merely a tool, it was a beacon, a promise, a quiet vow that no darkness would ever be left unacknowledged. She left the little shelter with a hand upon the doorframe, offering gratitude to the space, to the story, to the unseen. A breath in, a breath out, and the day was done. And each pulse of the flame became part of a tapestry that both wrapped around her and wove through her. Perhaps once it had been a roadside shrine, or a wayfarer's resting place, built long ago and forgotten by time. But now, it waited in the dark like something that remembered being useful. Elira approached it with reverence, her footsteps slowing as she drew closer. The vines, green and thick, parted slightly at her presence, revealing an arched doorway still intact, its wood weathered to a smooth gray. It was in moments like these that she often felt the memories of others pass through her, like shadows brushing her shoulder, or whispers too soft to form words. The inside was dry, dusty, and filled with the faint scent of thyme and dried linden, herbs placed there long ago and preserved by luck and quiet air. She stepped to the center, knelt, and placed the lantern before her. She simply made room for them to be heard. Its glow reached to the low walls, to the splintered beam overhead, to the corners where spiders had woven webs like lace across history. She bowed her head, not in prayer, but in listening, for in places like this, stories lived in silence. She did not ask them to speak. Not haunting, never that. These were echoes of healing, of lives touched gently, of sorrow met with warmth. The lantern carried them all, not to burden, but to preserve, to witness what the world might forget. The world around her seemed to pause, not in silence, but in that sacred in-between where noise becomes music and motion becomes dance. It was the hour of hushes, of slow reflections, of breath sinking with dusk. She did not sleep in the way most do, not diving down into the depths of dreaming. And so she sat, neither fully awake nor truly asleep, her breath as slow as the river, her presence as still as the rooted tree behind her. Elira stirred only slightly when the moon appeared, a slender silver arc hung low above the treetops, its light more suggestion than illumination. Or where? She only knew that someone would. The way birds find wind. Her eyes opened not with urgency, but with knowing. She reached for the lantern and lifted it slowly, letting its light mingle with the cool tones of moonlight, their contrast beautiful in its balance, the warm gold and the quiet silver, dancing together across the riverbank. She stood, brushing her cloak gently free of bark and moss, and stepped away from the oak. She did not know who would find her next. The river curved away from her left side, its surface now glinting with the moon's reflection. A small structure ahead, half covered in vines, its roof leaning but not collapsed. It was not a home, nor a barn. She entered without hesitation. And slowly, as if unspooling from the walls themselves, the memory came. A woman had once wept here, not loudly, not despairingly, but in the quiet way of one who has no more voice to give grief. Elira did not try to comfort what had passed. When she rose again, the wind moved through the doorway, and the vines rustled faintly, as though breathing. And then, she walked on. Her steps took her across a stony ridge now, where the river curved away and the land opened into heath and scrub, low plants stretching out beneath the stars. And beneath that sky, Elira walked onward. Not seeking. Not fleeing. Only moving. Carrying the light. Being the light. They walked the old road together, 6 living souls and 1 beloved body, accompanied not by ceremony but by the steady crunch of feet on gravel, the sigh of the wind through tall hedgerows, and the quiet unwavering glow of the lantern held gently in Elira's hand. The road curved lazily through the valley, sometimes bending past groves of alder and ash, other times tracing the rise of earth where wildflowers leaned into the path, their petals trembling in the soft hush of morning's approach. And in its center stood a simple circle of stones half sunken into moss, their lichen-covered faces all turned inward like ancient watchers. The face beneath the veil was peaceful, lips closed, brow smooth, as though even in death, she was listening to something beautiful. But its warmth spread through the clearing in waves so subtle they were felt only in the loosening of jaws, the lowering of shoulders, the sighs drawn not from lungs, but from the soul. They bowed their heads, eyes closed or open, hands resting on knees or pressed to the earth. She lifted the lantern with both hands, not high, not in ritual, simply in offering. And in that golden breath of morning, the flame within the lantern shifted, pulsing brighter for just one slow, long heartbeat. And then settled once again into its soft, familiar glow. She did not count the hours until she would be needed. The lantern would know. And when the time came, the light would carry her to the place where the silence waited to be seen. Birds began to sing again, each note a thread weaving its way into the tapestry of morning. The grasses swayed like waves, stirred by wind and wonder alike. And in the space behind her, the clearing slowly returned to its stillness, not empty, but complete. And Elira, too, knelt, not as priestess, not as guardian, but as one who honors what has passed without needing to hold it back. The lavender had begun to release its scent under the warming air, a mingling of earth and sky, of flesh and leaf. She turned instead toward the far side of the clearing, where the stones gave way to meadow and a path not yet worn awaited her feet. The lantern remained steady, casting long beams ahead as she moved, and the breeze that greeted her was warm and rich with promise. And in the stillness that followed, something larger than the sum of their grief wrapped around them all. A resting place, perhaps. They lowered the stretcher gently, reverently, and arranged their offerings around it, the reed flower, the box, the cloth, tokens of affection, fragments of meaning. They touched one another gently, an arm on a shoulder, a hand clasped briefly in another, and began to gather their things. The body would rest here now. The sky above was a deep, deep blue now, no longer night, not yet day, that mysterious threshold hour where time seems to hold its breath and the veil between what is and what was becomes tissue thin. Elira did not lead. But alongside, her presence quiet as a shawl draped over weary shoulders. The lantern, though unchanged in size, seemed to fill more space now, as though grief itself had made room for it. The body they carried was light, not because it had no weight, but because love carried most of the burden. Their silence was not emptiness, but fullness, the kind of silence that holds stories, memories, the unsaid words that weave tighter than rope. After a time, the road brought them to a clearing where the land opened wide to the sky. Elira stepped forward and placed the lantern at the foot of the stretcher, letting its light fall fully across the body's length. The light did not flare. It did not flicker. In that space, time folded. Not stopped, not broken, but softened, like linen washed and worn, wrapped gently around the moment. And as the first true rays of sunlight crested the distant hills, slipping between stones and lighting the veil upon the body in a golden whisper, Elira rose. The companions stirred, not with urgency, but with renewal. Elira stepped away as they began their return down the path. She did not follow. Nor did she linger. Ahead, the land was unfamiliar, a new road, a new sky, a new day unfolding with the hush of possibility. Elira did not wonder where the next village would be. And so, she walked. Steady. Quiet. Glowing. The path ahead was soft and winding, curving along the contours of the land, as though it had been traced by the slow hand of time itself. Elira walked with her usual quiet grace, the lantern at her side swinging just slightly, its golden glow now almost indistinguishable in the growing light of day, and yet it still held its own like a candle beside the sun, not diminished, but content in its purpose. The meadow through which she passed was alive with small movement, the twitch of rabbit ears in the thicket. The woman's eyes lifted, and though her lips did not part, her hands stilled for a moment, not in reverence, but in respect. There, beneath a willow tree that drooped its arms over the water like a gentle guardian, she placed the lantern on the ground and sat cross-legged beside it, her hands resting loosely in her lap. The lake lapped quietly at the shore. Dragonflies flickered through the air like living shards of stained glass, their wings catching glints of gold from the lantern's flame. Elira nodded once and continued. The silent landing of a hawk in a distant tree, the rustle of morning breeze through reeds not yet dried by heat. She felt it as a tightening in the breeze, a hush in the birdsong. Something was unspoken here. She moved through it all like a shadow of stillness, touching nothing, and yet affecting everything. He paused several paces from her, eyes shifting from the lantern to her face, unsure whether to speak. The village she came upon by mid-morning was built on a gentle slope that overlooked a broad, glimmering lake, its surface rippling like silk beneath the breath of the wind. The light from the lantern spread across the room like balm, touching walls, floor, cloth, skin, and though nothing was healed in that moment, nothing was solved or cured, everything shifted. The fear ebbed. The tightness in shoulders released. And in its stillness, the boy's breath steadied. The teacher exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. And one of the children, the smallest, let out a soft sigh, curling gently to one side in sleep. At the school, one by one, they placed their hands over their hearts. Not as command, not as tribute, but as understanding. The children, some of them, she lingered longest beside one boy, his cheeks pale, his chest rising with quiet strain. She knelt, placed the lantern beside him, and laid her palm lightly above his heart, not pressing, only feeling. She reached down and lifted it, then stepped toward him, placing one hand gently on his arm. Their color returned. Their limbs relaxed. And the fear that had hung over the village like storm clouds now lifted, burned off not by fire, but by faith, not the loud kind, but the kind carried in the footsteps of a woman who asked nothing and gave everything. Not as healer, not as savior, but as one who bore light into the rooms where fear had grown. Some villagers came and went, some lingered in the doorway, some stood outside with heads bowed. No words were spoken. There was no ritual. Only light. He led her through the village without words, his pace quick but never frantic, and the people stepped aside as they passed, not out of fear, but in quiet awe, as though watching the wind take form. Boats bobbed at the dock, some tethered loosely, others drawn up onto the shore. And sun-bleached wood, its windows open to the air, though the curtains hung still. Inside, the air was thick, not only with heat, but with worry. A handful of children lay upon beds, pushed close to one another, their breathing shallow, their brows damp. A woman, the teacher, perhaps, sat beside one of them, her hands trembling as she wiped a child's face with a cool cloth. The villagers who noticed her did not greet her with fanfare, nor fear, only recognition. The kind that lived not in names, but in stories passed from one tired mother to another, from shepherd to child, from baker to fisherman. They knew the figure with the lantern. Children played barefoot in the shallows, splashing each other with cupped hands and laughter, their voices rising into the sky like birds released. Elira paused on the ridge above, her eyes scanning the rooftops, weathered tiles, thatched cottages, wooden beams silvered with age. Smoke lifted from hearths, and the scent of baking bread drifted on the breeze, mingling with the earthy sweetness of damp soil and flowering rosemary. She descended quietly, following a footpath bordered with elder shrubs and wild sage, the lantern brushing softly against her leg as she walked. She passed a potter kneeling at her wheel, hands slick with clay, shaping a vessel that trembled slightly at her approach. She came to rest beside the lake, where flat stones lay warm from the morning sun. The air here was peaceful, but beneath its stillness was the faint thrum of something unsettled, not loud, not panicked, but present, like a distant drum heard through layers of cloth. A young man approached from the village. "There's illness," he said, his voice hoarse with fatigue. He did not finish the sentence. Elira rose slowly. The school stood at the far edge of the village, a long, low building built of fieldstone. Elira stepped inside. The air changed instantly. Elira did not speak. She simply moved through the room, stopping at each bedside, letting the lantern's glow fall upon each small face, each pair of clasped hands, each furrowed brow. The flame grew still. She remained in the school for hours, though no one marked the time. And by afternoon, the children began to sleep more deeply. When Elira stepped out once more, the villagers watched her pass. And the lantern, unchanged, still glowed. The sun was setting by the time Elira passed once more through the outer edge of the village, her feet finding the pale thread of a path that led toward the western hills. Behind her, the lake shimmered in the warm light, and the rooftops caught fire in the way only slate and fading gold can, not with flame, but with the kind of radiance that seems to rise from within. The wind had softened into a breeze barely strong enough to stir the leaves, and the hush that blanketed the earth was not the stillness of exhaustion, but of rest, the kind of rest that follows relief, the kind earned only after care has been given, after worry has been met with something strong enough to hold it. Elira walked without hurry. The road ahead was narrow and climbed gradually, winding through fields marked by old stone fences and small groves of hawthorn and birch. A fox darted ahead of her, pausing only once to glance back, amber eyes catching the last of the light, before vanishing into the shadows. Elira placed the lantern upon it and sat beside it, her legs folding easily beneath her cloak, her hands resting gently upon her knees. Crickets began to stir in the underbrush, and the sound of their chorus rose slowly, filling the spaces between footfalls like music designed to soothe the dusk. The light from the lantern did not compete with the darkness, it joined it, became part of it. A whisper among silence. A warmth among coolness. A breath drawn in slowly and held in peace. The lantern she carried did not flicker, it pulsed. But she allowed her eyes to close. Its glow had shifted subtly since she left the schoolhouse, no longer soft gold, but warmer, deeper, touched with the faintest red, like embers banked for the night. But in sensation, the press of hands into soil, the weight of old grief settling over shoulders, the sighs of generations exhaled into the roots of the trees. They did not speak of them. The youths had seen many things. But they remembered. But as a thread in the long weave of compassion. And in their presence, she allowed herself to feel the ache of all she had carried, not as a burden, it cast longer shadows now, shadows that trailed behind her like memories, stretching along the ground, reaching across the fields as though seeking something they could never quite name. Not sacred in name, but sanctified by time, by stillness, by the quiet understanding that not every place must be changed to hold meaning. The air here felt cool, even in the breath of summer. She stepped between the trees, and at once, the world seemed to exhale around her. She did not speak. She did not speak. It was a place apart. She crested the hill just as the sky turned violet, and there, ahead, stood a grove she had not expected, a ring of yews encircling a hollow of wild grass and stone, untouched by fence or plow. Wrapped in a dark shawl that shimmered faintly in the lantern light. Her steps made no sound on the mossy ground. But she stepped into the circle and knelt across from Elira, mirroring her posture, lowering her head in quiet recognition. In the center of the grove, A large flat stone jutted from the earth like the back of a resting creature, weathered, lichen-covered, its surface cracked but not broken. Elira watched. Night fell. Not quickly. Not harshly. But in a slow unfolding, as though the sky was closing a great velvet curtain stitched with stars. Elira did not need to sleep. But when the first streaks of dawn brushed the sky in delicate rose, she rose. Her hand touched the stone, the same one that held the lantern, and her palm rested there a long moment. And then the visitor turned, not away, not toward, but upward, and was gone. In the stillness, she heard the past. Not in words. Not in voices. The light beside her pulsed again. And slowly, something shifted. A figure approached the edge of the grove, not from the road she had taken, not from any direction she could name. A woman. Tall. Elira did not flinch. Did not question. There was no need. The lantern flickered, not in distress, but in greeting. And in the breath that passed between them, something ancient unfolded. Not history. Not prophecy. Just presence. Shared and still. Together, they sat. Time passed like mist, curling, drifting, never settling. The second woman, the visitor, did not age, did not fade. Not vanished. Simply, no longer needed. Elira looked to the lantern. Its glow remained unchanged. And yet she knew, something had been exchanged. Not taken. Not lost. Given. She lifted it once more, her fingers wrapping around the handle as though greeting an old friend, and stood. The youths did not move. But they remembered. And as she stepped from their circle, the path ahead unfolded once again, not straight, not wide, but waiting. Always waiting. The morning air was tinged with coolness, the kind that comes just before the heat returns, crisp, clean, carrying the scent of damp moss and stone kissed by dew. Elira stepped back onto the path, with the lantern in hand, its flame steady now, neither growing nor dimming, simply present. The earth beneath her feet had shifted since the grove, softer now, loamy it coiled through the meadow like an ancient serpent, cutting through the land not in defiance but well tended, its buildings close-knit, its chimneys already beginning to release thin plumes of smoke into the air. There was a bridge that crossed the river just up ahead, narrow. Her face was pale, not from illness, but from waiting. There was something about the way she stood, not afraid, not sad, but open, like the banks of the river, ready for something greater than herself. And in its flicker, the girl's breath became visible, not from cold, but from stillness. When Elira came into view, the girl did not step forward or call out. I wasn't sure. She drew close, and for a moment, the two of them stood together in silence, the river murmuring beneath, the lantern's glow stretching long across the wood. And lo, made of sun-bleached wood and worn stone, with a gentle arc that caught the light like a held breath. She didn't finish the thought. She only lifted the lantern slightly, letting the flame fall fully across the girl's small frame, illuminating the fine, trembling lines of her mouth, the tautness in her fingers. And as the light reached her, the girl exhaled. But in understanding, as if it had been carved not by erosion but by conversation between rock and time. She followed its bank, not hurriedly, her boots sinking now and then into patches of marshy ground where reeds clustered and dragonflies hovered like jeweled sentries. and damp, strewn with fallen leaves that didn't yet belong to autumn but hinted of it all the same. As she moved down the hill, the land opened into a broad expanse of meadow, where the wind moved more freely and the world felt wide again. There, surrounded by hedges and old trees, stood a single gravestone, modest, unadorned, worn from wind and rain. So was the date. She stepped forward and placed the lantern gently upon the stone. Fresh. Recent. She did not chant. She only let the light remain, soft and constant, golden and deep, like the memory of warmth on winter skin. The soil still bore the signs of recent hands. And Elira breathed it in, that wideness, that hush, a breath as long and deep as the valley itself. I didn't know what else to do. Her fingers hovered, reverent, curious. Her cloak brushed softly against the tall grass as she walked, the folds trailing quietly behind her, gathering droplets like tiny beads of memory that clung for a time before vanishing into the warmth of the sun. Said if you ever saw it, you were safe. The sky was pale gold above her, streaked with high, delicate clouds that moved as if directed by some silent conductor. There was a river here, not the same one she had followed before, but a wider, slower one, deep with age, its waters dark and reflective. Eventually, the shape of a town emerged on the other side, not large, and on that bridge stood a girl. She was no more than 10, small and still, her dress a little too short at the ankles, her hands folded tightly in front of her. Elira reached the bridge and paused. But with preparation, as if the whole place was holding its breath, knowing something unseen was unfolding. People watched from windows, from porches, from doorways, not with suspicion, but with the hush of reverence. The lantern glowed faintly in the morning light, its golden heart pulsing with a rhythm that seemed to match the river's. They said you might come, the girl said softly, as if speaking into the wind. Elira stepped onto the bridge, the boards beneath her feet creaking with age. My mother, the girl began, but her voice caught. Elira did not ask. She used to tell me stories about a lady with a light, she whispered. Elira knelt before her. The flame grew steadier. The girl reached out, not to touch the lantern, not to take it, but simply to feel the air around it. And Elira nodded. They crossed the bridge together, one tall, one small, their shadows long behind them. They walked through the edge of the town, through early morning quiet, the kind filled not with bustle. The girl led Elira not to the town center, nor to a house, but to a small garden just behind a row of cottages. The girl stepped back. Elira did not answer. For a long time. She did not pray. And slowly, the girl's breath became easier. Her eyes closed. And in the heart of the town, in the center of the garden, in the silence of morning, everything was still. They stayed beside the grave until the sun had risen high enough to begin warming the tops of the hedges, casting sharp, dappled shadows across the garden path. The girl had knelt for a while, then sat with her arms around her knees, gaze unfixed but steady. She looked up at Elira, her expression softer, cheeks no longer tight with strain, and asked, "Will she see the light?" She gave the faintest nod, not of confirmation, not of certainty, but of shared belief. And in that simple gesture, something settled inside the child, as if the ache of loss had found a place to rest that was no longer sharp. Not gone, but bearable. The silence between her and Elira was not hollow. It was full of the words she didn't know how to say, full of memories she hadn't yet been brave enough to recall, full of questions that had no need for answers. And through it all, the lantern remained where Elira had placed it, its flame a quiet heartbeat against the day, not demanding attention, only offering space. Elira followed it, her steps light, the lantern swinging gently at her side, its glow now muted under the brightness of the sun, but no less present. But because she had already been fed in the ways that mattered most. She walked not for speed, but for presence. Every step deliberate. Every step offered. The path climbed steadily, taking her away from the town, into the quiet arms of the countryside. There, the air changed. Not colder, not yet, but damp, rich, filled with the scent of moss, old bark, and fern. It might once have been beautiful. It might still be. But now, it sat quiet and shuttered, the door slightly ajar, as though someone had left long ago and never returned. She knew, without needing to know, that the path ahead would take her to a place touched not just by memory, but by sorrow that lingered. Birds sang again, not loudly, but clearly, their songs crisscrossing the air like fine threads stitched between trees and stone. The girl moved down the path and toward the cottages, her steps slow but sure, her silhouette growing smaller with each breath, not shrinking, but growing into herself, piece by piece. But to remind it that it was not alone. The light grew brighter, warmer, not in blaze, but in depth. In longing. It filled the corners of the room, reaching under the shelves, along the baseboards, up to the beams overhead, not to banish shadow, it had been folded away, wrapped into daily tasks, buried beneath well-swept floors and quiet tears at dusk. And now, with Elira's presence, with the steady, wordless witness of the lantern's glow, that sorrow breathed again. The path ahead was clear once more. Not to overwhelm, but to exhale. Not loud. Not full. But faint. Her hands were strong and confident, her face lined with a life of labor, but her eyes met Elira's with quiet recognition. The birds had returned to their song. In the corner, an old harp stood, its strings broken, its frame leaned wearily to one side. She paused there, letting the lantern's light fall across the wood, and for a moment, she could hear the music. As if the echo of a melody still lingered in the spaces between the broken strings. She did not speak. She only bowed her head, then returned to her dough, folding it over with a motion as rhythmic as prayer. Not abruptly. Not as if waking from sleep, but as if a tide within her had turned. A teacup, dry. A woven shawl hung across the back of a chair. Eventually, the girl stirred. Elira reached out and gently rested her hand on the girl's shoulder. The kind of feeling that settles when grief is not given voice, when love has no outlet, when longing becomes architecture. She entered slowly, letting the light fall first across the wooden floor, the stone hearth, the low-beamed ceiling where shadows gathered like resting birds. They stood together, and the girl took one last look at the lantern before stepping back. She came upon a stone house built low into the side of the hill, half hidden beneath creeping ivy and the shade of drooping branches. "I think I can go now," she whispered, "if that's all right." Elira stepped aside, letting her pass, her cloak trailing lightly across the grass. When she had gone, Elira turned again to the stone. The light played gently across the name, catching in the carved letters and the cracks that time and weather had begun to open. A breeze swept softly through the garden, stirring the drying herb crown atop the grave. Elira watched it for a moment, then lifted the lantern and moved once more toward the path. As she left the garden, she passed through the back gate of the cottages, where a woman stood kneading bread on a floured board. Beyond the cottages, the road curved toward the hills. Not in haunting, not in harm, but in remembrance. Midday passed. She did not pause for food or water, not because she did not need them. The road narrowed again, winding into a small wood where the light grew soft and green beneath a canopy of leaves. And sure enough, just past the bend where two elms leaned close like whispering sisters, Elira stepped to the threshold and paused. The lantern pulsed once. The air inside was still and heavy, not with dust, but with feeling. There were books on the table. It was not abandoned. It had been left behind. She moved through the house as one would walk through memory, slowly, respectfully, without touching what could not be touched. She sat then, in the middle of the room, and placed the lantern before her. And as she sat there, the sorrow in the house stirred. Something had once been lost here, not just a person, but a part of someone's self. And it had never been spoken aloud. The room changed. The air lightened. And when Elira rose once more, she placed her hand on the harp's frame. The lantern pulsed, and the faintest hum rang out, one broken note, soft and true, vibrating through the wood like a memory finally allowed to speak. She left the house with the door gently closed behind her, the ivy brushing her shoulder as she stepped back into the wood. The sorrow had been seen. And so, Elira walked on. Beyond the quiet house, the forest grew less dense, the canopy lifting slowly as though exhaling from a long-held breath. Elira moved easily between slender trees whose bark shimmered faintly with the moisture of the day, the moss beneath her feet soft as woven cloth. She followed a worn path through tall heather and wild grasses, their stalks nodding against her cloak. From her vantage point, Elira could see a trail of smoke curling from a cottage chimney far below, and beyond that, the faint glint of a glass window catching the light, like a wink from something ancient and amused. Its roof sagged slightly on one side, the stones along its base were mossy and uneven, and the path to its threshold was flanked by dozens of small objects, bowls, wooden carvings, bits of ribbon, polished stones, dried flowers, and handwritten notes that had long since lost their ink to rain and wind. Illuminating the love within them, the hopes once whispered into their shapes, the fears folded quietly beneath their placement. She walked slowly, the lantern brushing the air like a finger across parchment, and the ground beneath her feet welcomed her weight with the softness of belonging. She walked slowly, the lantern brushing the air like a finger across parchment, and the ground beneath her feet welcomed her weight with the softness of belonging. An offering place. There was no village here. Only scattered homes, cradled in folds of earth, each one distant from the other, held apart by meadows, by hedgerows, by silence. We buried her beneath the rowan tree. A hearth near the far wall, where coals glowed but did not flame. His clothes were simple, his face weathered. When he looked up, his eyes did not widen in surprise. He only nodded, once, a gesture of recognition that went deeper than sight. He had been waiting, though he had not known it. Only the dullness. Like everything's gone gray. Even the birds. A woven mat at the center of the floor, ringed by worn cushions. And a man. Above, the clouds had gathered loosely, not in storm, but in shape, like thoughts drifting through an uncluttered mind. The world was still. The world was still. Not with my eyes. But I feel her. I just want to stop hurting so quietly. In the way my knees ache when I rise. And I don't know if it's real. And as he did, something in his expression shifted. Not release. Not joy. In the wind. A softening that comes when someone finally feels seen. In the smoke from the hearth. The room grew deeper, the shadows rich and kind. The man looked up again. But the smallest easing of the lines near his eyes. Or if I just want it to be pale and round and silent. The fever took her. Not heavier. Not lighter. Just more real. As though the world had finally come into focus. Quickly. We had no time. Ferns fanned outward like green lace at her ankles, and here and there, mushrooms bloomed from fallen logs. The lantern at her side glowed without ceremony, its light catching dew on leaves and spider silk in the shadows, gilding the underbrush with a touch that was never harsh, never cold. It was not the light of command. It was the light of permission, of allowing things to be seen gently, without shame. Just space. Open space. By late afternoon, the trees began to thin, the ground rising into a slope of windswept moor where the air grew broader, the sky deeper, the wind more curious. Its light stretched outward, casting soft amber across the floor, touching the edges of the hearth, the man's face, the low wooden beams above. The air shifted. At the crest of the hill, the land opened again into a long, shallow valley. She descended the slope with a slow, even stride, the lantern leading, as always, not ahead, but beside. The further she walked, the more she felt the rhythm of the valley, a quiet heartbeat that pulsed beneath the soil, within the grass, in the flight of insects and the hush of wind across stone. It was a place where time had softened its grip, where routine had become ritual. And where pain, when it came, settled deep into the bones of the land rather than rising up in noise. At the bottom of the valley, tucked into a gentle depression in the earth, stood a weathered building, part home, part sanctuary. Elira paused before entering. The lantern pulsed in her hand, and its light bent forward, touching the objects on either side of the path. Inside the building, the air was warm. There were no pews, no altar, no iconography. He sat near the hearth, his head bowed, hands clasped in his lap. "My daughter died last winter," he said quietly. Elira said nothing. She stepped into the space and placed the lantern on the ground at the center of the mat. "She was only 12, he said. Elira sat on one of the cushions. She placed one hand over his, holding it for just a moment. Then she turned and took up the lantern again. The man watched the flame. "There's peace, they say," he murmured, "if you wait long enough. But I haven't found it." Elira closed her eyes. The lantern grew warmer. "I see her sometimes." A pause. He bowed his head again. "I don't need her back. I know that's not how it works." And then he said nothing more. Elira reached toward the lantern and placed one hand gently over the glass. The flame inside stilled, its flicker narrowing into a soft, steady glow, like breath held. He said nothing more. He didn't need to. Elira rose and walked to him. At the threshold, she paused. "I don't know what she believed," the man said, "but I think she would have liked this." Elira stepped outside. Behind her, the coals in the hearth stirred. The smoke rose straighter, and a sparrow began to sing. The path beyond the sanctuary house curved gently uphill, flanked by thickets of alder and clusters of tall goldenrod, their heads bowing in the fading light. The day had passed softly, and now the world leaned gently toward evening once more, the sky painted in long strokes of lavender and coral, the sun dipping below the hills in silence. Elira's shadow stretched long across the path behind her, accompanied only by the pool of warm light from the lantern she carried, its glow now vibrant again in the approaching dusk. She walked slowly, not because of weariness, but because this hour, the tender space between sun and moon, was not one to be rushed. Birds called out the last notes of the day from within the hedges, their tones growing round and golden, not urgent, not sad, but restful. The earth itself seemed to soften, as if sighing in gratitude for another day survived, another day sung. I've been sitting here all afternoon, but sunken, as though they had settled into the ground under the weight of time. Beneath its boughs sat an old woman on a three-legged stool, a knitted shawl drawn around her shoulders, her gaze lifted toward the rising stars. You can sit, if you like. I don't mind the silence. The woman's eyes settled on it, and for a moment, her whole body seemed to lean toward its warmth, like a blossom tilting to the sun. But not like that. Not since I was a child. It was you, wasn't it? She neither confirmed nor denied. You haven't aged a day. The lantern glowed quietly between them. It's a better companion than most. She did not seem startled by Elira's approach. Instead, she nodded, as though greeting a familiar figure from a dream. They formed a ring, imperfect but whole, with tufts of wild grass growing between them and pale lichen blooming along their weather-worn surfaces. I don't think I dreamed you. Elira approached with a slow, reverent tread, her steps brushing softly through the grass, the lantern casting its glow ahead of her in gentle arcs. Etched into its surface was a spiral, the lines worn soft by age and thumb. I always knew it wasn't mine to keep forever. It pulsed faintly in her hand, not with magic, but with memory. She touched the woman's shoulder with a hand both warm and light. I'll be seeing my father again soon. I think he'd be glad I returned it. A token of a story long buried, now brought again to light. I used to wonder if it was a dream. If I'd imagined it. But now, beyond the ridge, the land dropped into a quiet glen, open and low, where a stream meandered lazily through banks of flowering mint and forget-me-nots. Didn't touch him. Didn't speak. My father was sick, coughing, weak. My mother had tried everything, but nothing worked. Just watched. And then she was gone. Didn't touch him. Didn't speak. My father was sick, coughing, weak. My mother had tried everything, but nothing worked. Just watched. And then she was gone. My mother said the woman with the lantern had sat by the hearth all night. Just sat. Elira followed its curve without question. There was a storm. She held it in both hands, as if weighing something invisible within it, then offered it to Elira without a word. And then, in the middle of the night, a woman came. No horse. No cart. Just walking through wind and rain, with a light that didn't waver. She had learned long ago that certain paths needed no signposts, that some places, like people, called to you when they were ready to be witnessed. At the far end of the glen, near the stream's bend, stood a circle of stones, not upright this time. In the center of the stone ring stood a tree, not tall, not old, but strong, its bark smooth, its branches shaped like an open hand. "I wondered how long it would take you," she said, her voice dry as leaves, but kind. Elira offered her the smallest smile, one formed not on her lips, but in the gentle tilt of her head, and stepped into the circle. The woman gestured to a smooth stone beside her. Elira sat. The lantern, placed between them, flickered once, then stilled. "I've seen many lanterns," she said softly. Elira said nothing. "I was 7, the woman continued, voice slow and rhythmic. She looked at Elira then, eyes pale and steady. Elira met her gaze. The woman chuckled once, not disbelief, but recognition. Another pause. "I remember waking in the morning," she said, "and the house smelled like rosemary. My father was asleep. The fever had broken." She leaned back slightly, her fingers tracing a pattern on the shawl draped across her knees. She looked again at the lantern, her voice low. They sat in silence, the stars unfolding overhead, the tree above them holding its breath. After a time, the woman reached down and pulled a small bundle from beneath her stool, a pouch of deep blue velvet, tied with a leather cord. Elira accepted it gently. She opened the pouch, and within lay a single stone, smooth, round, the color of river water. "It's the only thing I kept," the woman said. "Of that night." Elira closed the pouch and tucked it into the folds of her cloak. "Thank you for carrying it," Elira said, the first words she had spoken aloud in many days. The woman blinked slowly, her eyes growing damp. Elira stood. The lantern rose with her. And as she stepped beyond the circle of stones, back into the darkening glen, the old woman bowed her head, not in grief, not in farewell, but in peace. Above them, the stars brightened. And beneath them, the earth held its stillness like a breath between lullabies. Elira stepped quietly out of the stone ring, her feet moving lightly over the moss-draped path, the lantern in her hand casting long and graceful beams that seemed to drift more than shine. The old woman remained behind, still seated beneath the tree, a solitary figure whose silence sang louder than any farewell. Elira did not turn back. Some partings did not require acknowledgement. The world simply shifted, like a feather changing direction in the wind, and both souls continued on, gently separated by the current of time. There were no fences, no walls, only low stone boundaries softened by centuries of moss and creeping wild thyme. There she waited, her lantern held close, its light casting the herb's thin leaves into golden lacework across the stone. She did not call out, nor did she knock at any door. His eyes searched the darkness, and when they found the lantern's glow, he froze. She simply stood, as she had done countless times before, in the stillness that always came just before she was seen. He stopped a few paces away. The windows of the houses glowed faintly from within, each light small and steady, as though the town itself breathed in sync with the stars. No dogs barked. No children shouted. It was a place wrapped in quiet, as if the hush had arrived long before Elira and taken up gentle residence among its people. She's been asleep for 2 days. Fevered. We've tried everything. The healer left last season. We thought she would wake, but the glen gave way to a narrow trail winding between clusters of ash trees whose branches arched overhead like the ribs of an ancient chapel, their leaves whispering softly with the first hints of evening breeze. The path sloped gradually downward, and with each step, the air grew cooler, tinged now with the scent of moss and something sweeter, lavender, perhaps, or wild hyssop growing unseen in the underbrush. Twilight had begun to deepen, not with haste but with elegance, slipping into the crevices between stones and shadow like water into cupped hands. Elira walked slowly. Her breath matched the hush of the wind, and her thoughts were not loud, not shaped into words, but woven into sensations. The rustle of branches, its glow stretched across the blankets, brushing the girl's face, her cheekbones catching the light, the furrow between her brows softening ever so slightly. Elira knelt beside her and placed her hand over the girl's hand, gently, as though she were made of glass. The lantern flickered once. Then again. Then settled into a rhythm that echoed the rise and fall of the girl's breath. Inside, the air was dim and close, carrying the smells of broth, sweat, and wild chamomile. The door stood open. The cottage was tidy, lived in. Simple. On the far side of the room, beneath a narrow window where moonlight filtered through linen curtains, lay a girl, no more than 13, her face flushed, her brow furrowed, her breathing shallow. A woman knelt at her side, her head bowed low over a cool cloth in a chipped basin. The yielding earth beneath her steps, the flicker of memory that surfaced each time the lantern-hess glow touched something forgotten. She passed beneath an outcrop where an owl sat watching, its round eyes blinking once, then following her with the stillness of perfect understanding. It did not fly. It only listened. And ahead, nestled into the hollow between two hills, was a small village, or perhaps a hamlet, no more than 7 or 8 cottages clustered loosely around a spring-fed well. She did not walk into the heart of the village, but paused just outside it, at the edge of a low wall where rosemary grew in tangled profusion. And soon enough, a door creaked open. A young man stepped out, barefoot, with a shawl wrapped hastily around his shoulders. Elira did not speak. The young man crossed the narrow garden between his cottage and the wall, his steps slow, his expression tight with fatigue and hope knotted together. "My sister," he said. His voice broke there. It didn't matter. Elira lifted the lantern slightly. The man nodded and turned. She followed him silently through the garden path, past a low bed of wilted mint and a wooden cart tilted on its side. When Elira entered, the woman looked up, startled, not in fear, but with the brittle disbelief of someone who had nearly run out of hope. And then she saw the lantern. And her shoulders sagged. She set the lantern at the girl's bedside. She stepped back without a word. Elira crossed the room slowly. No one spoke. They did not need to. The air shifted. The room deepened. Time softened its edges, and for a long while, they simply sat together, the brother, the mother, the woman with the lantern, and the child, who began, breath by breath, to return. Her eyelids fluttered. Her lips parted. And a long, low sigh escaped her. She slept now, truly slept, for the first time in days. And the lantern glowed. Elira rose. The mother took her daughter's hand. The brother closed his eyes. And outside, the moon rose higher, its silver light wrapping the village in silence once more. Elira stepped once more into the night, her lantern steady in hand, the warmth of the cottage fading behind her like the echo of a lullaby hummed behind a closed door. She did not look back. She never did. Perhaps Aristote, pausing briefly in its nightly foraging to observe the silent traveler with golden light at her side. Beyond them stretched a wide moor, flat and open, the grasses sighing under the touch of wind, their feathery tops stirring like the surface of a quiet sea. Only this open space, the hush of the earth, and the lantern's unwavering breath beside her. Yet even here, the journey continued. Not in steps, but in being. At its crest stood a single tree, twisted, bowed, and leafless, but not dead. Its bark glowed faintly in the lantern's light, silvered and scarred, like an old woman's hands folded over a prayer. Beneath it, stones formed a low ring, their placements too exact to be random, too humble to be grand. The sky above was vast and filled with stars, not crowded, not overwhelming, the kind of pulse that lives beneath the skin of the world. The kind of memory that remembers itself only in light. She laid both hands upon the earth and bowed her head, and in that gesture, something ancient passed through her, not as a message, not as a command, but as a gift freely given. It flowed through her fingers into the soil, and from the soil back into her bones. It was not healing, nor power, nor promise. She lifted the lantern, letting its golden heart shine not outward, but upward, toward the gnarled branches, toward the stars just beyond them, toward whatever it was that waited there in the space between knowing and mystery. Always walking. Always listening. No visions. Only a sense, unmistakable, of presence. And as the light rose, the wind answered a slow breath drawn across the land, circling the tree, touching the grass, stirring the hem of her cloak. But arranged with the same careful hand that drew the folds of her cloak or guided the reach of the flame she bore. It made no sound, only blinked once, and then scurried off again, unconcerned. Even the wild knew her as something to be trusted. She passed a tumbled-down shepherd's hut, its roof long gone, its hearth cold, but the stone walls still holding, as though memory alone kept them upright. She passed a pool where frogs croaked softly in the reeds, their voices round and rhythmic, echoing like the last notes of a chant meant for no one. She left it at the tree's base, its glow casting long shadows along the ring of stones, painting the bark with living light. For a time, she stood apart, watching. She walked beneath a sky that watched without speaking, and across ground that had once known footsteps like hers, long ago, and had waited patiently to feel them again. She gathered the lantern in both hands, and the flame shifted once more, not brighter, not dimmer, but changed, as if it had learned a new word in the long language of silence. And the moon's light flowed over the rooftops of the slumbering hamlet, washing every thatch and stone with a silvery calm. Even the wind seemed to whisper slower now, as though it, too, was easing into a quieter breath. As she passed beneath a stand of old birches near the well, their white trunks gleaming in both moonlight and lantern glow, a small creature rustled in the undergrowth, a hedgehog. She left the village by the eastern trail, a narrow path winding between low ridges where dry stone walls ran half-toppled with time, their boundaries now more suggestion than protection. Out here, under that sky, Elira's pace slowed further. She walked for what might have been hours, or only minutes, the way time stretches and contracts when one walks alone in the company of silence. Eventually, the moor dipped, and in its fold she came upon a small, wind-worn hill, not high, but purposeful, shaped by time and story. Elira approached and stood in the center of the ring. There were no voices. She closed her eyes. And in the stillness that followed, something deep within the earth stirred, not movement, not sound, but recognition. Elira knelt. She placed the lantern at the tree's roots, where moss grew thick and damp, and the soil smelled of rain long past. It was simply belonging. When she rose, she did not reclaim the lantern immediately. Then, as the stars wheeled onward and the first faint glimmer of dawn touched the far edge of the moor, she returned to the tree. Elira turned from the tree, from the stones, from the ring of the hill and the hush of the glen, and she walked again. The light followed. Or perhaps it led. And across the dark, the world breathed. As the dawn slowly unfurled behind her, casting pale light across the moorland in quiet hues of pearl and soft rose, Elira continued onward, her lantern once again cradled in her palm, casting its faithful glow into the fading night. The stars above had begun to vanish one by one, not suddenly, but as if tucking themselves back beneath the great tapestry of sky, satisfied that the world below could carry on without their watchful shimmer, for now. The moon had already slipped down the horizon, leaving behind its silence and its mystery like a kiss on the brow of the earth. The road ahead was not truly a road, more a suggestion of one, barely pressed into the moss and scrub. But Elira followed it with the ease of one who does not seek direction from markings or signs. No markers. I didn't know where to begin, so I just started walking. No sound but the rhythm of her footfalls and the quiet song of birds awakening to the day. Yet the sense of movement remained, not because she moved, but because the story moved through her, each step an unwritten word, each breath a verse that had waited until now to be spoken. He hasn't spoken in weeks. Not since the fire. They said he doesn't eat, doesn't sleep. Just stares out the window. His mother sings to him, but he doesn't turn his head. The dew on its blades catching both the sun and the lantern's glow, day and story braided together. They passed through a narrow stone gate, across a low meadow filled with buzzing insects and bending poppies, and then through a birch grove that whispered and creaked with the rising wind. She saw the lantern. In the corner of the main room sat a child on a low stool, no older than 9, his face turned toward a shuttered window, though the light did not reach him. But with release, as though her voice, held in her throat for days on end, had finally found a place to fall. His eyes were open but unfocused, wide and distant, as though they saw a sky no longer present. A woman sat nearby, singing softly, her voice cracked from repetition, her hands in her lap. She stopped when Elira entered. Neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. She did not walk to arrive. She walked to carry, and to keep. Her steps found the way as naturally as water finds the slope of stone, and the lantern in her hand adjusted itself to the morning air. But in temperature, in breath, in the settling of dust that no longer needed to hang in the air. She simply let the light be there, and in that light, something invisible began to uncoil. The boy blinked once. His fingers, which had remained curled against his knees, unfurled just slightly. His gaze did not shift, but it softened. And the woman, his mother, sat down again beside him, this time with her hands open on her thighs, her shoulders no longer drawn so tightly toward her ears. No movement from the yard. Only stillness. The main house was broad and low, its roof mossy in places, its windows small but bright. A garden ran along its left side, and a well stood in its center, a wooden bucket half lowered. There was no smoke from the chimney, softening its light until it was no more than a breath of gold riding beside the rising sun. There were no houses here. And then, just before the horizon lifted into its full light, she saw a figure ahead. It was rare. Not unheard of, for some still wandered the same roads, though fewer and fewer each season, but rare nonetheless, to meet another between places. The figure moved with care, not fast, not slow, and as Elira neared, she saw that it was a man of middle years, gray at the temples, a satchel on his back, a walking stick in one hand. His clothes were practical, clean, the cloak about his shoulders patched but sturdy. He stopped when he saw her, tilting his head slightly, and then, though he didn't smile, he bowed. "I hoped I'd find you," he said, his voice as even and calm as the land itself. Elira didn't speak. But the lantern flared ever so slightly in her hand, a response. The man nodded once. "There's a boy," he said. Elira stepped forward, and together, without further explanation, they began walking in the direction from which he'd come. The sun crested the hill as they walked, casting long shadows before them, and the grass seemed to grow greener beneath its light. At last, they came to the edge of a farmstead nestled into a shallow valley, the kind of place made not by design but by use, built slowly over years, piece by piece. Elira entered without hesitation, the man following a few paces behind. Inside, the air was hushed, thick with quiet and the scent of soot and wool and herbs long dried. She rose quickly, startled, confused, and then stopped. And she wept. Not with fear. Not with desperation. Elira walked forward and knelt beside the boy. She set the lantern upon the ground. She did not speak to him. The flame pulsed. And for a long while, nothing else moved. But the room changed. Not in the visible ways, no sudden light, no magical hum. Elira did not touch the child. When she stood to leave, the boy's head tilted the smallest amount, not in recognition, but in awareness. She left the lantern by the hearth, just for a while longer. Outside, the sky had turned to full day. The man waited on the edge of the field, eyes closed, face tilted toward the breeze. And Elira, the lantern once more in her hand, walked on. Beyond the farmhouse, the land rose into low hills that rolled like waves half remembered in sleep. The grasses here were taller, untouched by scythe or hoof, and the wind moved freely through them, combing long strands of green and gold into shifting patterns that never repeated. She moved with no urgency, no hesitation, simply with purpose shaped by presence. The lantern, ever at her side, glowed faintly in the daylight, not competing with the sun, but walking beside it. There was a quiet dignity in the way it shone, even when unseen by others, not for acclaim, not to lead, but to accompany. The sky overhead was blue now, clear and full, but soft, as if it too were resting after having watched the night unfurl. Elira walked not as a stranger but as something familiar to the land, her shape and rhythm absorbed into the textures of the morning. A direction that couldn't be named, only followed. She followed a narrow game trail that wove between blooming elder trees and stony outcroppings, the ground beneath her feet dappled with fallen petals and faint prints left by deer. The light filtered down in long shafts, striking the dust and pollen that floated lazily in the warm air, turning it all into slow-moving gold. She untied the bundle gently, her fingers tracing the knots with care, and laid its contents out upon her lap, a child's shoe, a strand of beads, a drawing faded with rain. Nothing more. Old and gray with a bundle tied to its base, cloth-dried flowers, a ribbon frayed with time. Nearby, a ring of stones framed a patch of blackened soil, as though a fire had once burned there and had not been rekindled since. The wind paused. She did not retie it. One voice becoming many, the canopy above filling with a symphony that had waited for the silence to finish speaking. She did not claim it. She only let it rest there, visible and witnessed. Elira's footfalls barely disturbed the forest floor. But because something beneath the roots, beneath the very soil, seemed to call for it. Bees droned softly in the underbrush, and larks trilled somewhere above, their notes falling like drops of water into a vast, invisible pool of silence. And then she rose. The water flowed with soft, constant grace, not rushing, but determined, brushing over stone and reed with the sound of long, slow storytelling. The lantern's light shimmered on the surface, its glow diffused and bent by the current. But beneath that flickering golden thread, the stream revealed something older, the worn, patient face of time. Not her own face, though hers was reflected faintly. But time itself, not as enemy, but as witness. The river did not grieve what it had passed, nor did it long for what had yet to come. It only flowed. It only was. Elira paused at the center of the bridge, resting the lantern on the low parapet. She leaned over and looked into the water. Everything around her was alive, but not loud. The world in this place knew how to breathe without needing to speak. By midday, she came upon a small stone bridge arching over a stream so clear that every pebble at its bed gleamed like polished glass. What she saw there was not a reflection, not exactly. She closed her eyes and breathed deeply, letting the sound of the water wash over her. And in that moment, she felt it again, that soft pull beneath the ribs, that gentle call not from ahead or behind, but from within. The path curved gently along the stream for a while, and then diverged, lifting into woods with tall-trunked trees whose limbs reached high overhead like archways in an abandoned temple. She emerged after some time into a clearing where the air smelled of resin and crushed pine, and in the center stood a wooden post. Elira approached the post and knelt beside it. She lit nothing. She said nothing. She placed the lantern in the ring of stones where the fire had once been and let its light spill outward. And the clearing listened. The trees did not creak. The leaves did not rustle. But something deep within the land shifted, a quiet acknowledgement, a loosening, a sigh. Elira remained until the light of the lantern stilled once more, its glow steady and soft, no longer stretching, no longer seeking. She left the bundle untouched. As she stepped once more into the trees, the birds began to sing again, slow at first then more boldly, and in that song, Elira walked on, a woman bearing no banner, no title, no name beyond what others whispered. Only the lantern. Only the light. The forest thinned as the afternoon wore on, the trees becoming fewer, their trunks spaced wide like old sentinels who had outlived the walls they once guarded. Moss gave way to dry leaf and root, and then to soft earth once more. Not because its weight had changed, but because it had been carried so long in the service of others that it had become part of her. An extension of her quiet. Of her listening. Of the space she made for others to rest. It did not need to blaze. It only needed to be. And that was enough. Elira walked in stillness, her breathing deep and even, her hands steady, her gaze resting not on any single thing, but on the space between. But wide and soft, like a field where no one had walked for a long, long time. It stood alone, half covered in ivy, its keystone worn smooth, its base cracked in places by roots. and beneath it, a doorway. The grasses were tall here, seated and waving in the late afternoon wind. As the day stilled, as the light of the sun reached its final arc, gilding the tops of the flowers, brushing her shoulders in farewell. Wildflowers bloomed in clusters, purple, yellow, white, nodding gently as she passed. The air was sweet with their scent, tinged faintly with something older, the rich breath of soil long undisturbed, and the thin, clean whisper of sky. And then gently dimmed, as though settling in for sleep. The space where one breath ends, and the next begins. It flickered faintly as she approached, and though she had never seen it before, she recognized it. The space where questions are not answered, but simply laid down beside you like a sleeping child. The lantern was lighter in her hand now. At last, the forest gave way entirely, and the land opened before her like a sigh, not dramatic, not grand. She followed no trail now. There was no need. The light knew where to go. Their lights met without merging, danced without competing, two notes in the same song, harmonizing quietly in the stillness of the hollow. And so did she. At the far end of the meadow stood a hill, not tall, but round and smooth, its sides gentle, its crown marked by a single stone arch. She reached it as the wind calmed. All unique. Some tall and narrow, others squat and round. Some made of iron, some of clay. She stepped beneath the arch. Beyond it was a hollow, a chamber carved of earth and stone, simple and bare. The walls were lined with shelves carved directly from the stone, and on each shelf sat a lantern, unlit. Dozens of them. Each one marked in some way, a small sigil etched in the handle, a pattern in the glass, a loop of ribbon still tied around the base. And then again. He dreamed of warm light and soft words spoken in languages he couldn't remember, but which soothed him anyway. He smiled in his sleep. She laughed again, deeper this time. And the dust that had long settled on the strings shifted just enough to let one final note hum, barely audible, before fading. Elira stood at the threshold. And the flame in her lantern pulsed once. The sound startled a bird from the grass. She stepped forward and walked to the center of the chamber. There, on a single raised stone, sat a lantern already glowing, soft, silver, different from her own. Not by sight, but by feel, by memory, by peace. She lifted her own lantern and placed it on the stone beside the other. And then, she sat. No audience. No witness. No need. Just breath. And earth. And story. The sun slipped behind the edge of the world, and above, the stars began to reappear, not in rush, not in ceremony, but in their familiar, unhurried way. In the village far beyond the forest, the boy in the farmhouse dreamed for the first time in weeks. In the stone circle beneath the gnarled tree, the old woman opened her eyes and whispered a name she hadn't spoken since childhood, and then, slowly, laughed. In the house with the broken harp, the wind blew softly through the cracked window. And in the field, in the chamber beneath the earth, surrounded by shelves of silent lanterns that once walked the world in the hands of other quiet souls, Elira rested. Not ended. Not lost. Only returned. The lantern glowed on. And the light listened. The story, yours now, continues. Just as it was always meant to. Thank you for listening to this quiet story. If you find rest in these tales, you're warmly invited to subscribe to Sleepy Whispers, where a soft voice and a gentle flame will always be waiting. For now, let go. Let the story drift away and rest.